In the autumn of 1858, when yellow fever still haunted the bayous of Louisiana like an ancestral curse, a will was read that defied every natural law known to man. The document, penned in the trembling hand of Evangeline Thibodeau, bore the seal of one of the most reclusive plantation families in the parish, a family whose name was spoken only in whispers and whose estate had been shrouded in rumors for nearly a decade. The executor, a meticulous man named Claude Rousseau, arrived at the Thibodeau plantation on a morning when fog clung to the cypress trees like burial shrouds. His leather satchel contained the necessary papers, his mind prepared for the routine transfer of property and assets. What he was not prepared for was the impossibility that awaited him behind the mansion's weathered doors. The will was specific in its language, almost unnaturally so. It spoke of the twins Celeste and Margot, aged 7 years, who were to be placed in the custody of the parish church. Simple enough, one might think. Children orphaned by tragedy were unfortunately common in those fever-stricken years. But as Rousseau would later document in his own meticulous records, nothing about the Thibodeau twins was simple. The house itself seemed to resist his presence. Built in the 1790s, it had once been a monument to wealth and influence, its columns rising like pale sentinels against the Louisiana sky. But time, or something more sinister, had claimed it. The paint peeled in long, deliberate strips, revealing wood beneath that had darkened to the color of dried blood. The windows, once bright with imported glass, now reflected nothing, as though light itself refused to penetrate their surfaces. Inside, the air carried the weight of decades. It smelled of old wood and damp stone, of candles burned down to their wicks, and something else, something that made Rousseau's throat constrict with an inexplicable dread. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, not with the familiar sounds of settling wood, but with what seemed almost like whispered protests. He found them in what had once been the parlor, positioned as though they had been waiting for his arrival. The sight stopped him in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass handle, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes reported. One child, if child was the proper word, crawled across the Persian carpet with the unsteady movements of an infant. Her limbs were soft and round, her face bearing the unmarked innocence of new life. She babbled softly to herself, reaching for dust motes that danced in the amber light filtering through the damaged shutters. The other sat motionless in a high-backed chair that seemed too large for her frame, yet somehow perfectly suited to her presence. Her back was curved with the weight of decades, her hands gnarled like ancient tree roots. Deep lines etched her face in patterns that spoke of sorrows accumulated over impossible years. Her eyes, when they met Rousseau's, held the profound weariness of someone who had witnessed too much, endured too long. Yet their faces, beneath the impossible differences in age, were identical. The same delicate bone structure, the same distinctive birthmark beneath the left ear, the same unusual violet tint to their eyes. Even their hair, though one's was the fine silk of infancy and the other's the brittle silver of advanced age, grew in the same patterns, with the same stubborn cowlick at the crown. Rousseau's documentation, preserved now in the parish archives, records his initial assumption that some terrible mistake had been made. Perhaps one was the child, the other an elderly relative forgotten in the will's language. But as he observed them through that long afternoon, other impossibilities emerged. The infant responded to sounds and movements made by the elderly figure, turning her head when the older one shifted, crying when she sighed. The aged child, for her part, seemed to anticipate the infant's needs, her weathered hand reaching out moments before the younger one would begin to fuss. They moved, Rousseau noted, as though they were two parts of a single being separated by some cosmic accident. When afternoon light slanted through the windows, both turned toward it with identical expressions of longing. When a door creaked somewhere in the house's depths, both startled with the same subtle jerk of recognition. The executor's training demanded documentation, evidence, rational explanation. But as evening approached and shadows lengthened across the parlor floor, Rousseau found himself confronting something that existed beyond the boundaries of his carefully ordered world. These were not simply two children of different ages bearing an unusual resemblance. These were the twins named in Evangeline Thibodeau's will, 7-year-old Celeste and 7-year-old Margot, identical in every way save for the impossible fact that one had aged 70 years, while the other remained frozen in infancy. The implications of this discovery would haunt Rousseau for the remainder of his days. In his final report to the parish authorities, he wrote, "I have witnessed something that challenges the very foundations upon which we build our understanding of life, death, and the passage of time itself. Whatever arrangement governed the existence of these children, it was not order, and by any natural law known to man." That night, as he prepared to leave the plantation and return with proper authorities, Rousseau made a discovery that would reshape his investigation entirely. Hidden within the folds of Evangeline's will was a key, small, brass, worn smooth by countless hands. Attached to it was a note written in the same trembling script, "The ledger will explain what I could not." The key led to a secretary desk in what had once been Evangeline's private study, a room that existed in a state of preserved decay, as though time had passed more slowly within its walls. Here, surrounded by the remnants of a once magnificent library, Rousseau discovered the first fragments of an impossible truth. Father Michel Boudreau, the parish priest who had ministered to the Thibodeau family for more than 3 decades, arrived at the plantation the following morning. His face, weathered by years of delivering last rites and offering comfort in humanity's darkest hours, bore an expression of profound reluctance. When Rousseau questioned him about the family's history, the priest's responses came slowly, as though each word carried a weight that threatened to crush him. "I have kept secrets that no man of God should bear," Father Boudreau confessed as they sat in the study, dust motes dancing in the pale morning light. But Evangeline Thibodeau was not evil. She was desperate, and desperation, Monsieur Rousseau, can lead good people to make bargains with forces that exist beyond our understanding. The story emerged in fragments like pieces of a mirror reflecting a reality too terrible to view all at once. 7 years prior, in the spring of 1851, the yellow fever had swept through the parish with particular vengeance. The Thibodeau plantation, isolated though it was, had not escaped the epidemic's reach. Evangeline's daughter-in-law, Marie-Claire, had fallen victim to the fever just days after giving birth to twins. The children themselves had been born weak, their cries barely audible above the sound of their mother's labored breathing. The plantation's physician, Dr. Hebert, had given them hours at most. In those final moments, as Marie-Claire slipped away and the infants grew weaker with each passing hour, Evangeline had made a decision that would condemn them all. "She spoke of a woman," Father Boudreau continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who moved through the shadows of New Orleans like smoke, who was said to possess knowledge that even Maman Laveau feared to claim. They called her Maman Laveau's shadow, but her true name was Marie Bordeaux, and she dealt in currencies more precious than gold. She traded in time itself." The arrangement, as Father Boudreau understood it, had been presented to Evangeline as salvation. One twin would bear the burden of aging for both, accumulating years, like a debt that compounded with each passing season. The other would remain frozen at the moment of the pact's making, preserved but not truly living, existing in a state between life and death that defied natural order. The price demanded by Marie Bordeaux had been steep beyond measure, not merely gold, though Evangeline had paid that as well, but something far more precious, a portion of her own life force, a connection that would bind her to the twins' fate as surely as if she had signed her name in blood. More than that, the arrangement required absolutes. To secrecy, absolute isolation. The twins could never leave the plantation, could never be seen by eyes that might question what they witnessed. Father Boudreau produced a small leather journal from beneath his cassock, its pages yellowed with age and handling. "She brought this to me 2 years ago," he said, passing it to Rousseau with trembling fingers. She could no longer bear the weight of what she had done, but neither could she bear to watch them die. This contains her attempts to document the impossible, to find some rational explanation for what she had wrought. The journal's first entry, dated May 15, 1851, was written in Evangeline's careful script. "The woman came as promised. The children breathe, though I fear what breath now sustains them. Celeste remains as she was at the moment of the arrangement, while Margot shows signs of change already. Her face seems older, though she has lived but 3 days. I pray that time will prove this choice wise, though my heart whispers that I have damned us all. Subsequent entries chronicled the gradual horror of the twins' transformation. Margot's first teeth emerged and fell out within weeks. Her hair grew white while Celeste's remained the fine down of infancy. Her spine began to curve as though compressed by invisible weight, while Celeste's limbs remained soft and undeveloped. Most disturbing of all, Margot's eyes began to hold knowledge that no child should possess. The accumulated wisdom and sorrow of years she had never lived but somehow experienced. The arrangement affected more than just the children, Father Boudreau explained, his voice heavy with the burden of long-kept secrets. The plantation itself began to change. Visitors would age rapidly during their stays, sometimes emerging from a single night looking years older. Clocks throughout the house began to run backward, or stopped entirely as though time itself had become uncertain within those walls. Evangeline's journal entries became increasingly frantic as the years passed. She described attempts to contact other practitioners, seeking someone who might reverse what had been done. She consulted physicians who fled in terror after examining the twins. She performed prayers and rituals learned from half-remembered folklore, burning sage and cedar in rooms where shadows fell in impossible directions. She came to me often in those final years, Father Boudreau continued, not for confession. She knew that what she had done lay beyond the reach of absolution, but for company. The isolation was consuming her as surely as the arrangement was consuming the children. She would speak of hearing voices in the walls, of seeing faces in mirrors that reflected not the present but other times, other possibilities. The priest's testimony revealed the true scope of Evangeline's torment. The twins' condition had created a kind of temporal wound within the plantation, a place where the normal flow of time had been disrupted. Servants fled, claiming that they aged days during single nights of work. Animals avoided the property entirely, as though sensing something fundamentally wrong with the very air. But perhaps most devastating of all was Evangeline's growing realization that the arrangement had not truly saved the children. It had trapped them in a form of existence that was neither life nor death, but something altogether more terrible. As Father Boudreau closed his journal and prepared to leave, he offered one final, chilling observation. In the end, Monsieur Rousseau, she understood that love, when twisted by desperation, can become the cruelest curse of all. The brass key opened more than a desk drawer. It unlocked a repository of impossible documentation that challenged every assumption about the nature of time, aging, and human existence. Within the hidden compartment lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Evangeline Thibodeau's increasingly erratic handwriting, chronicling 7 years of supernatural observation with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher studying the incomprehensible. The ledger's first entries possessed the clinical detachment of scientific inquiry. Evangeline had approached the twins' condition with the same systematic methodology she had once applied to managing a vast plantation. Each page was dated, each observation recorded with careful attention to detail, as though documentation itself might somehow impose order upon chaos. May 20th, 1851, 5th day since the arrangement. Celeste remains unchanged. Weight, length, responses all consistent with initial measurements. Margot has grown 1/4 inch in length, though this appears to be accompanied by a subtle loosening of the skin, as though her form expands without corresponding development. Her cry has deepened noticeably. June 2nd, 1851. Margot's first tooth has emerged, but it appeared gray and slightly loose. Celeste shows no signs of teething. I have observed that when one twin experiences discomfort, the other responds with agitation, suggesting some form of sympathetic connection beyond normal sibling bonds. July 15th, 1851. A disturbing development. Dr. Hebert visited to examine the children at my request. After spending 2 hours with them, he emerged looking visibly aged, his hair noticeably grayer, lines around his eyes more pronounced. He claims to feel dizzy and disoriented. He will not return. As the months progressed, Evangeline's documentation revealed the true horror of what she had wrought. Margot's aging accelerated with each passing season, but it was not the normal progression of childhood development. Instead, she seemed to accumulate the wear and decay of years without gaining their corresponding experiences or knowledge. Her teeth fell out while Celeste's first teeth never emerged. Her hair thinned and whitened while Celeste's remained the fine silk of infancy. The psychological implications proved even more disturbing than the physical transformation. Margot retained the emotional responses and mental capacity of a child, but her aging body created a disconnect that manifested in heartbreaking ways. She would reach for objects with the coordination of a toddler, but her gnarled hands could no longer grasp them properly. She would attempt to play with toys meant for her age, but her curved spine and stiffened joints made such activities impossible. March 10, 1852. Margot attempted to crawl today, as she has observed Celeste doing. The sight was indescribable. Her aged limbs moved with the uncertain motions of infancy, but her frail bones could not support even her slight weight. She cried afterward, not the wail of a frustrated child, but something deeper, more profound. I believe she understands on some level what has been done to her. The ledger also documented phenomena that extended beyond the twins themselves. The plantation house began exhibiting temporal anomalies that defied rational explanation. Breakfast would be served at midnight, with no explanation from the servants who prepared it. Seasons would change within individual rooms, frost appearing on windows during summer months, flowers blooming in midwinter. Visitors reported experiencing days that lasted only hours or hours that stretched into seeming eternities. Most unsettling we have. Evangeline's observations about the twins shared consciousness. Despite their physical differences, Celeste and Margot seemed to exist as two parts of a divided whole. When one experienced pain, the other would respond with immediate distress. When one slept, the other would become drowsy. Most remarkably, they appeared to share dreams, often being found in identical positions in separate rooms, their faces bearing the same expressions of wonder or fear. September 3, 1853. I discovered both twins positioned identically this morning. Celeste in her crib, Margot in her chair, both with their heads tilted toward the east window, both with their right hands extended as though reaching for something invisible. When I spoke Celeste's name, Margot turned. When I touched Margot's shoulder, Celeste began to cry. I am convinced they share not just a connection, but a single consciousness somehow divided between two forms. As the years progressed, Evangeline's handwriting deteriorated along with her mental state. The precise documentation gave way to rambling entries filled with guilt, desperation, and growing horror at what she had unleashed. She described attempts to break the arrangement through various means, prayer, ritual, even attempting to contact Marie Bourdeau again, but all proved futile. January 1, 1855. The new year brings no hope. Margot now appears to be a woman of 30, though she has lived but 4 years. Her mind remains that of a child, trapped within a form that ages daily. Celeste has not changed by so much as an ounce. I have created not a miracle, but a prison, and I am the warden of my own grandchildren's suffering. The ledger's later entries revealed that the temporal distortions around the plantation had begun affecting Evangeline herself. She aged rapidly in the years following the arrangement, her own life force draining away as payment for the supernatural bargain she had struck. Her hair whitened, her hands developed tremors, and her vision began to fail with unnatural speed. But perhaps most horrifying were her descriptions of the twins' nighttime behaviors. Both children would sometimes speak in their sleep, but in a language that no one in the household could identify. They would move through the house during the dark hours, Celeste crawling while Margot shuffled with her aged gait, both seemingly guided by some shared purpose that existed beyond conscious thought. April 20, 1857. I followed them last night to the old slave quarters where they positioned themselves in a circle that had been burned into the earth, a circle I do not remember being there before. They remained motionless for hours, not sleeping but not fully awake, as though communing with forces I cannot perceive. When dawn came, they returned to the house, neither seeming to remember their nocturnal journey. The final entries in the ledger revealed Evangeline's growing understanding that the arrangement would not simply continue indefinitely. Marie Bourdeau had warned that the 7th anniversary would bring a crisis, a moment when the accumulated temporal energy would require renewal or release. As that date approached, Evangeline's documentation became increasingly frantic, filled with desperate calculations and half-formed plans for breaking the supernatural chain that bound her grandchildren. December 1st, 1857. The 7th year approaches, and I can feel something building within the house itself. The twins grow restless, both showing signs of awareness that some culmination approaches. Margot, though her body appears ancient, has begun speaking with the wisdom of someone far older than her years should allow. Celeste, though still infant in form, watches me with eyes that seem to hold terrible knowledge. I fear that whatever is coming will be far worse than anything we have yet endured. The trail that led from the Thibodaux plantation to the hidden practitioners of New Orleans was marked not by roads or rivers, but by whispered names and carefully guarded secrets. In the Treme district, where free people of color had built a community that existed in the shadows between worlds, certain knowledge was passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, dangerous to possess, but too valuable to discard. Rousseau's investigation into Marie Bourdeau required delicate navigation through networks of trust and suspicion that had been built over decades. The official records held no trace of her existence, no birth certificate, no property deeds, no legal documents of any kind. But in the oral histories preserved by families whose ancestors had sought her services, her legend lived on like smoke that never fully dissipates. She had emerged in the years following Maman Laveau's rise to prominence, claiming to be the great voodoo queen's true successor in matters that even Laveau would not touch. Where Maman Laveau dealt in love potions and protection charms, in healing and harm that remained within the boundaries of the natural world, Marie Bourdeau trafficked in violations of cosmic law itself, manipulating the fundamental forces that governed existence. The apothecary shop that had served as her front still stood on Rampart Street, its windows boarded and its sign long since faded beyond recognition. But in the basement beneath, accessible through a hidden entrance in the building's foundation, Rousseau discovered a chamber that challenged every assumption about the limits of human knowledge. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. But instead of bottles and herbs, these shelves held hundreds of hourglasses, some no larger than a child's palm, others standing nearly as tall as a man. Each glass container was filled with sand of different colors and textures, ranging from the pure white of beach sand to the deep black of cemetery soil. Small brass plates beneath each hourglass bore inscriptions in various hands, marking names, dates, and cryptic symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. At the chamber's center stood a massive oak table, its surface scarred by decades of use and marked with intricate carvings that formed patterns too complex for casual observation. Burn marks suggested that candles had been arranged in specific configurations, while dark stains indicated that other, more disturbing materials had been employed in whatever rituals had taken place within these walls. Father Boudreau, who had reluctantly agreed to accompany Rousseau on this investigation, stood in the doorway as though afraid to enter the chamber itself. "She called this her temporal archive," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Each hourglass represented a client, a manipulation of time that she had performed. The sand came from graves, from places where time had been disrupted by death or trauma. Among the hourglasses, Rousseau found one that bore Evangeline Thibodaux's name on its brass plate. The glass was larger than most, its sand a disturbing mixture of white and black that seemed to swirl without any apparent motion. Unlike the others, this hourglass was cracked down one side, a thin line that ran from top to bottom like a wound that refused to heal. The chamber's walls held additional documentation, journals written in Marie Bourdeaux's precise hand, detailing techniques and theories that existed far beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Her notes revealed a woman who had studied not just the folklore and traditions of various cultures, but the fundamental principles that govern time, aging, and the connection between consciousness and physical form. "Time," one entry read, "is not the river that most perceive, flowing in one direction from source to sea. It is an ocean, vast and deep, with currents that can be redirected by those who possess the knowledge and will to do so. The aging process is merely one manifestation of time's passage, and like any natural force, it can be controlled, concentrated, or transferred according to need." Marie Bourdeaux's methods involved what she called temporal manipulation, the ability to concentrate or dilute the effects of time within specific individuals or locations. The process required substantial payment, not merely in material goods but in life force itself. Each client who sought her services paid a portion of their own vitality, creating a reserve of temporal energy that she could then redistribute according to the terms of their agreement. The Thibodeau case had been particularly complex because it involved twins, individuals whose life forces were naturally entangled from birth. Bordeaux had recognized that this connection could be exploited to create a temporal sharing arrangement, where the aging process affecting both individuals could be concentrated in one, while leaving the other suspended at the moment of the pact's creation. But the documentation also revealed the true horror of what such arrangements entailed. The process was not simply a matter of transferring years from one person to another. It created a supernatural wound in the fabric of reality itself, a distortion that affected not just the immediate participants, but everyone and everything in their proximity. The longer such arrangements persisted, the more unstable they became, requiring increasingly desperate measures to maintain. The 7th year marks the critical threshold, Bordeaux had written. By this point, the accumulated temporal energy has reached a state of dangerous instability. Without intervention, the arrangement will collapse catastrophically, consuming not just the primary subjects, but potentially everything within the affected area. Renewal requires a sacrifice of extraordinary magnitude, typically the willing surrender of the life force that initiated the original pact. Most disturbing of all were Bordeaux's observations about the psychological effects of temporal manipulation. Individuals subjected to accelerated aging retained their original mental and emotional development, creating a profound disconnect between mind and body. Children trapped in elderly forms experienced not wisdom, but confusion, their consciousness unable to reconcile the contradiction between their perceived age and their physical reality. The chamber's final secret lay in a series of mirrors arranged around the walls, each reflecting not the viewer's current appearance but various stages of their aging process. Rousseau found himself staring at his own reflection, but not as he was, but as he would be in 10, 20, 50 years. The effect was profoundly unsettling, a visual reminder that time claimed everyone, regardless of their knowledge or intentions. Father Boudreau discovered a final journal hidden behind one of the mirrors, its pages filled with Marie Bordeaux's increasingly erratic handwriting. The entries described her growing awareness that her manipulations of time were beginning to affect her own existence. She aged and regressed unpredictably, sometimes appearing as a young woman, other times as an elderly crone, her physical form reflecting the temporal chaos she had created around herself. "I have become what I sought to control," her final entry read. "Time no longer flows through me in any natural pattern. I exist in all ages simultaneously, watching my past and future unfold in fragments that make no coherent sense. The Thibodeau arrangement was my greatest achievement and my ultimate undoing. When their 7th year arrives, the collapse will claim not just them, but the very foundation upon which I built my power. I pray that those who find this record will possess the wisdom to leave such forces undisturbed." The chamber held no trace of Marie Bordeaux herself, but scattered across the floor were piles of sand in various colors, the contents of hourglasses that had apparently shattered simultaneously, as though some great force had swept through the room and destroyed the carefully maintained temporal balances all at once. The implications were clear and terrifying. Marie Bordeaux had become a victim of her own manipulations, her existence scattered across time like sand across stone. Within the walls of the Thibodeau plantation, where time itself had become a weapon wielded against innocence, the twins existed in a state that defied every assumption about human consciousness and connection. Their shared existence transcended the physical impossibility of their condition, revealing depths of supernatural entanglement that challenged the very nature of individual identity. The household servants who remained during those final years, those few brave or desperate enough to continue their employment despite the house's growing reputation for supernatural phenomena, provided testimony that illuminated the true scope of the twins' shared consciousness. Marie Boudreau, the elderly cook whose own grandmother had worked for the Thibodeau family since before the Civil War, spoke in hushed tones about the children's uncanny synchronization. "They were like two parts of one soul," she confided to Father Boudreau during one of his increasingly frequent visits to the plantation. "When little Celeste would cry, old Margot would weep tears that seemed to carry the weight of decades. When Margot felt pain in her aging bones, Celeste would become inconsolable, reaching toward her sister with tiny hands that couldn't bridge the terrible distance between their different worlds." The servants' accounts revealed behaviors that suggested the twins operated with a form of consciousness that existed beyond individual awareness. They would often be discovered in identical positions throughout the house, Celeste in her crib and Margot in her chair, both facing the same direction, both with their hands positioned identically, both bearing the same expression of distant contemplation. More unsettling still were the reports of their nocturnal activities. The twins would move through the house during the dark hours with apparent purpose, despite Celeste's limited mobility as an infant and Margot's increasing frailty as her aging accelerated. Night servants reported finding them positioned in perfect circles of salt or ash, circles that none of the household staff remembered creating, arranged in patterns that seemed to focus supernatural energy like a lens concentrates light. Dr. Auguste Marigny, one of the few physicians brave enough to examine the children after Dr. Hebert's disturbing experience, documented phenomena that challenged every medical principle he had studied. His notes, preserved in the archives of the New Orleans Medical Society, describe observations that read more like supernatural investigation than clinical examination. The subjects present a medical impossibility that nonetheless exists as observable fact. The infant, designated as Celeste, exhibits all the physical characteristics of a child approximately 8 months of age, yet has maintained these exact measurements for over 3 years, according to household records. More remarkably, she responds to stimuli directed toward her twin with the same intensity as if the stimulus had been applied directly to her own person. The aged child, Margot, presents the physical characteristics of a woman in her 6th or 7th decade of life, yet her responses to cognitive testing suggest the mental capacity of a child no more than 4 years of age. Most disturbing is the evidence of shared sensory experience. When pressure is applied to Celeste's limbs, Margot reacts with corresponding distress, despite being in a separate room and having no visual awareness of the examination. The shared consciousness extended beyond mere physical sensation into realms that defied rational explanation. Both twins would sometimes speak simultaneously in a language that none of the household staff could identify, not French, nor English, nor any of the African dialects familiar to the plantation's community. The sounds they produced seemed to follow grammatical structures, suggesting genuine linguistic communication, but the words themselves bore no resemblance to any known human language. Evangeline's own observations, recorded in journals separate from her primary ledger, revealed her growing horror at the depth of the supernatural connection she had inadvertently created. She described finding the twins positioned identically in different rooms, both staring at specific points on walls or ceilings where nothing visible existed, both moving their lips in silent conversation with invisible presences. I have begun to suspect that the arrangement has done more than simply transfer the effects of aging between them. It has created a form of existence that exists partially outside our normal understanding of individual consciousness. They share not just pain and sensation, but awareness itself. When I speak to one, both understand. When I offer comfort to one, both receive it. They have become something unprecedented, 2 bodies housing a single soul that has been divided by supernatural force. The isolation imposed by their condition extended beyond the twins themselves to encompass everyone who came into contact with them. The plantation's social connections withered as word spread about the strange phenomena occurring within its walls. Neighbors who had once visited regularly found excuses to stay away. Business associates conducted their affairs through intermediaries, rather than risk personal exposure to whatever supernatural forces governed the household. This growing isolation had profound effects on everyone who remained within the plantation's boundaries. The servants reported experiencing shared dreams filled with imagery of hourglasses and mirrors, of faces aging and regressing in endless cycles, of voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Several fled during the night, leaving behind their belongings and wages, rather than spend another day in proximity to the twins' unnatural existence. Father Boudreau himself began experiencing phenomena that suggested the twins' condition was somehow contagious, spreading its influence to anyone who spent extended time in their presence. He aged noticeably during his visits, his hair whitening and his movements becoming more labored with each pastoral call. But more disturbing were the changes in his perception of time itself. Hours that seemed to pass in minutes, Days that stretched into seeming weeks, moments of temporal disorientation that left him uncertain whether events had occurred in the past, present, or some impossible future. "I find myself questioning not just what I witness, but when I witness it," he wrote in his private journals. The twins exist in a state that challenges linear time, and prolonged exposure to their condition seems to disrupt one's own temporal anchoring. "I experience memories of conversations that have not yet occurred, and find myself aging years during single visits to their home." The most heartbreaking aspect of the twins' existence was their apparent awareness of their own trapped state. Despite their physical limitations, Celeste's infant form and Margot's aged frailty both demonstrated a form of understanding that transcended their apparent developmental stages. They would reach toward each other across the impossible gulf that separated their different states of being, their expressions holding a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just their personal tragedy, but the cosmic injustice of their situation. As the 7th anniversary of the arrangement approached, the twins' behaviors became increasingly synchronized and purposeful. They would position themselves in specific locations throughout the house, apparently responding to some countdown that only they could perceive. Their shared consciousness seemed to be preparing for something, a culmination or conclusion that would resolve the supernatural tension that had built around them over the years. The servants who remained reported that the house itself seemed to pulse with anticipation during those final weeks, as though the very walls were aware that some great change approached. Time moved differently in various rooms. Clocks ran backward or stopped entirely, and shadows fell in patterns that defied the position of the sun. The twins, at the center of these phenomena, waited with impatience that seemed both childlike and ancient, their shared soul preparing for whatever resolution their impossible existence demanded. As winter gave way to spring in 1858, the 7th anniversary of the arrangement approached like a storm gathering on the horizon, visible to those who knew how to read the signs, but invisible to the outside world that remained unaware of the supernatural drama unfolding within the Thibodaux plantation's decaying walls. The house itself seemed to sense the approaching culmination, manifesting temporal distortions that grew more severe with each passing day. Evangeline's final journal entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting as her own aging accelerated under the weight of the supernatural bargain she had struck, documented phenomena that challenged the very foundations of reality within the plantation's boundaries. Time had become elastic, unpredictable, dangerous, a force that could no longer be contained within the careful parameters Marie Bourdeau had originally established. March 15, 1858. The breakfast bell rang at midnight, though cook Marie swears she prepared the meal at dawn. When I descended to the dining room, I found yesterday's dinner still warm upon the table, though the servants insist it had been cleared hours ago. The twins were positioned at their usual places, Celeste in her high chair, Margot in her customary seat, both staring at food that seemed to age and refresh in endless cycles before their eyes. The temporal fractures were no longer confined to subtle anomalies. Rooms within the house began experiencing different seasons simultaneously. The parlor where the twins spent most of their time remained locked in perpetual spring, with flowers blooming from cracks in the wallpaper and a warmth that had nothing to do with any earthly source of heat. Meanwhile, the upper floors had fallen into deep winter, with frost forming on windows despite the Louisiana climate, and servants reporting that their breath became visible when they climbed the stairs. Most disturbing of all were the reports of temporal echoes, glimpses of the house as it had existed in different time periods. Servants would catch fleeting glimpses of the mansion in its original glory, with walls freshly painted and chandeliers blazing with light that belonged to decades past. Others reported seeing the house as it might exist in some distant future, crumbling ruins overgrown with vegetation, empty rooms where wind whistled through broken windows. The twins themselves began exhibiting behaviors that suggested they were experiencing multiple time periods simultaneously. Celeste would reach for objects that weren't there, her infant hands grasping at toys that had been broken years ago or had never existed at all. Margot would respond to voices that no one else could hear, carrying on conversations with invisible presences that seemed to span generations of the Thibodaux family. April 2nd, 1858. I discovered Margot speaking with someone she addressed as Grand-Mère Celeste, my own grandmother, who died 40 years ago. Her voice carried the inflections and mannerisms of childhood, yet she discussed events from decades before her birth with perfect accuracy. When I asked her who she was speaking with, she looked at me with those ancient eyes and said, "She's teaching me what I need to know for when the circle closes." Evangeline's investigation into breaking the arrangement had led her deep into the archives of supernatural knowledge that Marie Bourdeau had left behind. The hidden chamber beneath the Rampart Street apothecary had revealed not just the methods behind temporal manipulation, but the terrible truth about its inevitable consequences. Every arrangement like the one governing the twins carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, a buildup of supernatural energy that would eventually reach a critical threshold. The 7th anniversary represented more than just a temporal milestone. According to Bourdeau's notes, it marked the point at which the accumulated distortions would begin consuming themselves, creating a cascade effect that would spread outward from the epicenter like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Without intervention, the collapse would claim not just the twins, but potentially everything within a radius measured in miles rather than feet. But intervention carried its own terrible price. The supernatural energy that had been building for 7 years could only be contained or redirected through the willing sacrifice of the life force that had initiated the original arrangement. Evangeline understood with growing horror that saving her grandchildren would require her own death, and even then, success was not guaranteed. April 20th, 1858. I have found references to the Grand Dissolution in Bourdeau's notes, a ritual that might break the arrangement by absorbing its accumulated energy into a willing vessel. The process requires the original negotiator to serve as a kind of spiritual lightning rod, drawing the supernatural current into themselves before releasing it through death. But Bourdeau warns that even successful dissolution carries risks. The twins might be freed, or they might simply die as they should have 7 years ago. There is no way to know which outcome will manifest. As the anniversary date approached, the house itself seemed to prepare for transformation. The servants reported that doors would open and close on their own, following patterns that suggested some invisible presence was moving through rooms in purposeful sequence. Mirrors throughout the mansion began reflecting not the present moment, but glimpses of the past and future, images of the twins as they had been on the day of their birth, visions of what they might become if the arrangement continued, glimpses of endings both hopeful and terrifying. The twins' synchronized behaviors intensified during these final weeks. They would move through the house in perfect coordination despite their vastly different physical capabilities, Celeste crawling while Margot shuffled with her aged gait, both following routes that traced complex patterns across the mansion's floor plan. When viewed from above, these paths formed intricate geometric designs that seemed to focus supernatural energy like a lens, concentrates light. Father Boudreau, whose own aging had accelerated dramatically during his frequent visits to the plantation, documented his final conversations with Evangeline during this period. She had become desperate, her mind fractured by years of guilt and supernatural exposure, but her love for the children remained undiminished. She spoke of feeling the twins' pain as though it were her own, he wrote. 7 years of watching their impossible existence had bound her to them in ways that went beyond normal familial connection. She described sensing their shared consciousness, feeling the weight of Margot's accumulated years and the terrible stasis of Celeste's suspended development. The arrangement had created a spiritual triangle, grandmother and grandchildren linked by supernatural forces that grew stronger and more painful with each year's passing day. The climax approached with the inexorable certainty of a natural disaster. Evangeline's final preparations involved gathering materials that Marie Bourdeau's notes suggested might channel or contain the supernatural energy that would be released during the dissolution ritual. Salt from graves where the dead had been buried alive, water from wells that had run backward, candles made from the fat of animals that had died during solar eclipses. But perhaps most importantly, she prepared herself spiritually for what she understood would be a journey into darkness from which she would not return. Her final journal entries took on the tone of a confession, as though she sought to purge herself of 7 years of accumulated guilt and regret before making the ultimate sacrifice. May 10th, 1858. Tomorrow marks the anniversary. I can feel the house straining against the supernatural forces that have built within its walls. The twins grow more restless with each hour, their shared consciousness apparently aware that some resolution approaches. I have made my peace with what must be done. Love, when it becomes desperate enough, can drive us to make bargains with forces beyond our understanding. Perhaps love, when it becomes brave enough, can also drive us to break those same bargains, regardless of the cost to ourselves. The supernatural tension that had been building for 7 years was about to reach its breaking point, and Evangeline Thibodeau stood at the center of forces that would determine not just the fate of her grandchildren, but the very nature of reality within the boundaries of her cursed estate. The morning of May 15th, 1858, 7 years to the day since Marie Bourdeau had first crossed the threshold of the Thibodeau plantation, dawned with an unnatural stillness that seemed to muffle even the sound of the wind in the cypress trees. The house itself appeared to hold its wreath, as though awaiting some cosmic judgment that would determine the fate of all who dwelt within its walls. Evangeline Thibodeau spent her final day in meticulous preparation. Following instructions she had pieced together from Marie Bourdeau's fragmented notes and her own desperate research into the supernatural forces that governed her grandchildren's existence. The ritual she planned to attempt had never been successfully completed according to the records she had found. Previous practitioners who had tried to break similar arrangements had either failed entirely or succeeded only in destroying everyone involved, including themselves. Father Boudreau arrived at sunset, summoned by a message that Evangeline had sent that morning. He found her in the study where so much of the family's tragedy had been documented, surrounded by candles arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. Her appearance shocked him. She had aged years in the days since his last visit, her hair gone completely white, her hands trembling with palsy that seemed to come from spiritual rather than physical causes. "I know what you intend to do," he said, his voice heavy with the burden of long-kept secrets. "I cannot offer absolution for what you are about to attempt because I do not understand the forces you seek to challenge, but I can offer you the comfort of human presence during your final hours." Evangeline's response, recorded in Father Boudreau's private journal, revealed the depth of her transformation from desperate grandmother to something approaching a mystic warrior prepared for battle with supernatural forces. "Absolution was never possible for what I began 7 years ago," she replied. "But redemption might still be within reach if I have the courage to pay its price." The twins themselves seemed aware of the approaching culmination. Throughout the day, they had maintained positions at opposite ends of the house. Celeste in the parlor where she had spent most of her suspended infancy. Margot in the upper bedroom where her accelerated aging had transformed her into a simulacrum of extreme old age. Yet despite the physical distance between them, they moved in perfect synchronization, turning their heads at identical moments, reaching toward invisible presences with matching gestures. As night fell, the temporal distortions that had plagued the house for years intensified dramatically. Clocks throughout the mansion began running at different speeds, some racing forward while others moved backward, creating a cacophony of tick and chime that followed no earthly rhythm. Mirrors reflected not the present moment, but fragments of the past 7 years, glimpses of the twins at various stages of their impossible development. Images of Evangeline's growing desperation, shadows of Marie Bourdeau performing the original ritual that had doomed them all. Father Boudreau's account of the final night provides the only witness testimony to what Evangeline attempted in those dark hours. He remained in the study, praying while she prepared for the dissolution ritual in the parlor where the arrangement had first taken hold. Through the walls he could hear her voice rising and falling in cadences that suggested she was reciting incantations in languages he could not identify. The ritual itself, as reconstructed from the physical evidence found afterward and Evangeline's final journal entry, involved an attempt to absorb all the supernatural energy that had accumulated around the twins over 7 years. Using her own life force as a conduit, she sought to draw the temporal distortions into herself, containing them within her mortal form long enough to ease them safely through death. "I feel the years flowing into me like water into a broken vessel," Her final journal entry read, the handwriting growing more erratic with each line. Margot's accumulated age, Celeste's suspended time, 7 years of supernatural tension, all of it pouring through my consciousness like fire through dry wood. The pain is beyond description, but beneath it I sense something else, the possibility of freedom. For the first time in 7 years I can feel the twins' connection to the arrangement beginning to weaken. But the process proved more violent and unpredictable than even Evangeline had anticipated. Father Boudreau described hearing sounds from the parlor that defied natural explanation, not screams of pain, but something more fundamental, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn and rewoven. The house shook as though caught in an earthquake, yet no tremor was felt in the surrounding countryside. Light blazed from the parlor windows with an intensity that had nothing to do with any earthly source of illumination. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural storm subsided into a silence so profound that Father Boudreau later described it as the silence that might follow the end of the world. When he finally gathered the courage to enter the parlor, he found a scene that would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his life. Evangeline lay at the center of the room, surrounded by the shattered remains of hundreds of hourglasses, not just the ones she had brought from Marie Bordeaux's chamber, but others that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, their sand scattered across the floor in patterns that resembled maps of countries that had never existed. Her body showed the effects of rapid aging that had compressed decades into hours, her skin wrinkled beyond her natural years, her hair bleached white as bone, her hands curled like ancient roots, but her face bore an expression of profound peace, as though she had finally found release from 7 years of accumulated guilt and horror. Carved into the wooden floor around her body were symbols that neither Father Boudreau nor any scholar he later consulted could identify, marks that seemed to pulse with residual supernatural energy, suggesting that Evangeline's sacrifice had indeed affected the fundamental forces that governed the twins' existence. The twins themselves were found in their respective locations, unchanged in their physical forms, but somehow different in ways that could not be easily quantified. Celeste remained an infant in appearance, but her eyes now held the aware alertness of a child her actual age. Margot still bore the body of an elderly woman, but her movements suggested a loosening of the supernatural constraints that had governed her existence. Most significantly, the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house for 7 years had lifted. Clocks resumed their normal operation. Mirrors reflected only the present moment. The temperature throughout the mansion stabilized, and servants reported that they no longer felt the weight of invisible presences watching from every shadow. Father Boudreau's final observation, recorded 3 days after discovering Evangeline's body, provided the most important clue to the ritual's ultimate success or failure. The twins no longer move in perfect synchronization. For the first time in 7 years, they appear to exist as separate individuals rather than two parts of a divided whole. Whatever Evangeline sacrificed herself to accomplish, it has fundamentally altered the supernatural arrangement that bound them. Whether this change represents freedom or simply a different form of imprisonment, only time will reveal. The aftermath of Evangeline Thibodeau's final sacrifice unfolded like ripples spread long across the surface of still water, each wave carrying implications that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of the cursed plantation. Father Boudreau, now the twins' reluctant guardian, found himself responsible for 2 children whose very existence challenged every assumption about the nature of life, death, and the passage of time. The removal of Celeste and Margot from the plantation to the parish rectory marked the beginning of a new phase in their impossible journey. For the first time in 7 years, they existed outside the supernatural boundaries that had defined their world, yet the effects of their prolonged exposure to temporal manipulation could not be simply left behind like discarded clothing. The rectory itself began exhibiting phenomena that suggested the twins carried some residue of their condition with them. Clocks throughout the building would occasionally run backward for brief periods. Mirrors would sometimes reflect rooms as they had appeared decades earlier, and visitors reported experiencing subtle disorientation, as though time moved differently within the building's walls. But these manifestations were shadows of what had plagued the plantation, manageable quirks rather than the reality-warping distortions that had made normal life impossible. Father Boudreau documented each incident with the same meticulous attention to detail that Evangeline had once applied to her tragic observations, but his records showed a gradual diminishing of supernatural activity rather than the escalating horror that had characterized the twins' early years. June 20th, 1858, 5 weeks since their arrival at the rectory. The incidents continue, but with less frequency and intensity. Celeste has begun showing signs of normal infant development. She attempts to pull herself to standing, shows interest in solid foods, responds to her name with appropriate attention. Margot, while still bearing the physical appearance of advanced age, demonstrates increased mobility and appears to be regaining some of the mental faculties that were suspended during her supernatural aging. Most remarkably, they no longer seem to share consciousness as they once did. The children's separation from their shared awareness proved both liberating and traumatic. For 7 years, they had existed as two aspects of a single being, their thoughts and sensations intertwined by supernatural force. Now, as individuals in their own right, they had to learn to navigate a world where their experiences belonged to them alone. Celeste's development followed patterns that were almost normal, if accelerated. Having been frozen at infancy for 7 years, she seemed eager to reclaim the childhood that had been stolen from her. She learned to walk within weeks, began speaking in simple sentences, and showed an intelligence that suggested her consciousness had been developing even while her body remained unchanged. Margot's transformation was more complex and troubling. Trapped in an aged body, but with the mind of a 7-year-old child, she faced challenges that no human had ever been forced to confront. Her physical limitations made normal childhood activities impossible, yet her mental development resumed at a pace that suggested she was trying to catch up to her chronological age. August 15, 1858. 3 months post-arrival. I have observed both children engaged in what appears to be play, though of a most unusual nature. Celeste constructs elaborate arrangements with her toys, castles of blocks, armies of dolls, while Margot observes and offers suggestions in a voice that carries the weight of her physical age, but the enthusiasm of childhood. They are learning to be sisters in the conventional sense, rather than two parts of a supernatural whole. The broader community's reaction to the twins' presence revealed the complex intersection of fear, curiosity, and compassion that governs human responses to the impossible. Parishioners who had known the Thibodeau family for generations approached the children with mixture of sympathy and unease. Their story, though known only in fragmentary whispers, had become part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging natural order. Some families offered help and support, providing clothing suitable for both an active child and an elderly woman, toys and books, simple companionship during the difficult adjustment period. Others avoided the rectory entirely, crossing themselves when they passed the building and teaching their children to do the same. Dr. Marigny continued his observations of the twins, documenting their gradual normalization with the same scientific rigor he had once applied to their impossible condition. His notes from this period reveal a physician struggling to understand whether what he witnessed represented genuine healing or simply a different manifestation of supernatural influence. September 3, 1858. Physical examination reveals continued anomalies that defy medical explanation. Celeste's development now proceeds at normal pace for a child her age, yet cellular analysis suggests her tissues retain some resistance to normal aging processes. Margot's aged body shows signs of improvement, reduced joint stiffness, improved circulation, better sleep patterns, yet she remains physically ancient while mentally developing as a child should. I am forced to conclude that Evangeline's sacrifice altered rather than eliminated the supernatural forces affecting her grandchildren. As autumn approached, the twins' integration into normal life seemed increasingly successful. Celeste played with other children from the parish, attended informal lessons with the local schoolmaster, and exhibited the normal curiosity and energy of childhood. Margot, despite her physical limitations, found joy in books and music, developing talents that suggested her accelerated aging had left her with unexpected gifts of patience and concentration. But their normalization came with a price that became apparent only gradually. Both children suffered from nightmares filled with imagery of hourglasses and mirrors, of faces aging and regressing in endless cycles. They would wake speaking words in the mysterious language they had once shared, their consciousness apparently still touched by echoes of their supernatural experience. More disturbing were the moments when they would suddenly stop their activities and stare at empty air, as though seeing presences invisible to everyone else. During these episodes, they would reach toward each other across whatever distance separated them, their expressions holding the same profound sadness that had characterized their years of shared imprisonment. October 31st, 1858. All Saints' Eve has brought a resurgence of the phenomena I had hoped were diminishing. Both children spent the day in a state of heightened awareness, responding to sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. They positioned themselves at opposite ends of the rectory, yet maintained identical postures and expressions throughout the day. I fear that their separation from the supernatural arrangement was not as complete as we had hoped. The winter months brought new challenges and revelations. As the anniversary of their arrival at the rectory approached, both children began exhibiting behaviors that suggested their connection to supernatural forces had not been entirely severed. Celeste would sometimes age visibly during periods of stress, her face gaining lines and her hair showing streaks of gray before returning to normal within hours. Margot would occasionally demonstrate knowledge of events she could not possibly have witnessed, speaking about conversations that had taken place in distant locations or describing people she had never met. Father Boudreau's final entries regarding the twins, written in the spring of 1859, revealed his growing understanding that some forces, once invoked, could never be completely undone. The children had been freed from the most horrific aspects of their supernatural prison, but they remained touched by experiences that placed them forever outside the boundaries of normal human existence. March 15, 1859. Nearly a year since Evangeline's sacrifice, and I am forced to acknowledge that the twin story has no conventional ending. They exist now in a state between the natural and supernatural, freed from their original curse but forever marked by its touch. They are learning to be human children, yet they carry within themselves knowledge of forces that most people never encounter. Whether this represents a form of salvation or simply a different kind of imprisonment, I cannot say. The twins' ultimate fate remains shrouded in mystery. Father Boudreau's records indicate that they vanished from the rectory on a spring morning in 1859, leaving behind only a room filled with toys that showed signs of both recent use and ancient age. No trace of them was ever found, despite extensive searches by parish authorities and concerned community members. Some believe they had simply died, finally released from the supernatural forces that had governed their existence for so long. Others whispered that they had been taken by surviving practitioners of Marie Bourdeaux's arts, sought out for the unique knowledge they carried about the manipulation of time itself. Still others suggested that they had transcended physical existence entirely, becoming something that existed between dimensions, touched by forces that normal humans could never comprehend. The truth, like so many aspects of their impossible story, remained hidden in the shadows between fact and legend, between the natural world and the supernatural forces that occasionally break through to touch human lives in ways that defy understanding. What remained certain was that love, when driven to desperation, could make bargains that echoed through generations, and that some prices once paid could never be fully refunded. In the end, the twins who aged in opposite directions became more than a supernatural anomaly. They became a reminder that the boundaries we assume govern existence are far more fragile than we dare to believe, and that the love that drives us to protect those we cherish can sometimes become the very force that dooms them to fates worse than the death we sought to prevent. The Thibodaux plantation stands empty now, its windows boarded, its grounds reclaimed by the Louisiana wilderness. But on certain nights when fog rises from the bayous and the moon casts shadows that fall in impossible directions, travelers still report seeing lights in the abandoned mansion's windows, lights that flicker in patterns too deliberate to be random, too purposeful to be mere reflections of distant stars. And sometimes, carried on the wind that moves through the cypress trees like whispered secrets from another time, visitors claim to hear the sound of children playing, one voice high and clear with the joy of new discovery, another deeper, weighted with knowledge that no child should possess, both harmonizing in songs that speak of love and loss, of time and eternity, of the prices paid when desperation seeks to bargain with forces that exist beyond the realm of human understanding.